Okay, this next video lecture is the continuation of our module 1. So this is still under the classification of costs. So here we will be discussing about the different types of cost according to their classification. So basically, when we say cost classification, this involves the separation of a group of expense into different categories or group of costs, okay, and expenses. Meaning, in this case, we will group them according, okay, to the different categories in which they belong. So, a classification system, this is used to bring to the management's attention the certain costs that are considered more important than others. So, of course, this is to engage also in their financial modeling. So, we have here the different types of cost classifications. So, here, because there are a lot of costs and expenses that are being incurred in a day-to-day operation of a business entity, and therefore, the management here needs the data, okay, which are relevant for decision making. So in this case, they should know also what are the classification of this cost to determine what are essential and what are not, or also to distinguish between what our costs and expenses are, that will help them in deciding for controlling these costs. Okay, so we have here the different cost classifications into different categories based on their purposes. So here we can classify cost according to their management function, ease of traceability, timing of charge against revenue, or this is our matching principle. Fourth is their behavior in relation to the business activity that takes place in an organization or in the production. And fifth is its relevance to decision making. So these are the most common classification or category of costs, which are very useful for the management decision making. So we will discuss first costs according to their management function. So first, we have what we call manufacturing costs. So in manufacturing costs, these are the costs that are spent to transform raw materials along with labor and factory overhead into finished goods. So manufacturing costs, basically, these are the three most important activity or item, okay, that relates to manufacturing cost. So we have cost from direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. Your factory overhead is basically all the indirect materials and indirect labor. Okay? For as long as they relate to the production, may it be directly or indirectly, they are all included under our manufacturing costs. So this is incurred in the factory to convert your raw materials to finished product. So it will include, again, raw materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. Okay, so that's for our manufacturing costs. Okay, so here we have the definition, or we will identify what are direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead for classification purposes. So when we say direct materials, these are the cost of items that form an integral part of the finished product. Meaning to say, these are the materials used that we can physically see in the product. So they refer to the major parts or ingredients of the product. What are our examples of direct materials? So they include wood. For example, our product is furnitures, So wood is considered to be a direct material. Steel in an automobile, water in bottled drinking water, fabric in shirts, and others which we can physically see in the product itself. That is what we call direct materials. What about direct labor? Direct labor, these are costs that are directly applied upon the materials to transform it into a finished product. So direct labor, this refers to the salaries and wages of the employees who directly work to convert these raw materials into finished goods. An example is a factory worker or an employee who is under the factory or production department of an entity. Their salaries and wages will be part of the direct labor, whereas the uh, salaries and wages of your CEO, of your accountant, okay, of the HR manager, so they do not belong to the direct labor because they are not actually performing a work that relates to the production of uh, raw materials into a finished product. So again, only those employees who are working to transform raw materials into finished product, that is their salaries and wages will be included under our direct labor costs. Okay. What about factory overhead? So factory overhead, they are also called as manufacturing overhead. You can use either factory overhead account title or a manufacturing overhead. They refer the same thing. Okay? So when we say factory overhead, this refers to all the costs other than our direct materials and direct labor that is spent in the production of goods and services. So again, please take note that these are the indirect materials and indirect labor. Okay, so what are the examples of indirect materials? When we say indirect materials, these are cost of nails, for example, in a furniture. So basically, upon looking into the item or furniture item, you cannot see instantly the nails. What we see is the design of the woodworks. But nails are essential for making the creative design of the furniture, isn't it? So that's why they are still part of our production cost, although they may be classified under the indirect materials. Another example of our indirect materials are thread in the case of apparel, clothing. Okay, so they are essential part as well, but we cannot see it in an instant, or they may be uh, they may be part of the product, but they are considered to be what do you call this, immaterial, or their part is just a small part, okay, compared to the direct materials. But again, they are part of the production, okay, glue and others. So those are the indirect materials. Okay, another example is the use of electricity in using the machine for production. So we cannot actually see the electricity in the product itself, but it is very important to operate the machine which produces the product. Okay, so that is also an indirect material. What about indirect labor? So these are the salary of your supervisor. Okay, so the supervisor is actually part of the production, but he does not actually work directly in the production. So he just oversee and supervise the workers. Okay, it is the workers that directly works for the production. So that's why workers' salaries and wages are part of the direct labor, whereas the supervisor's salary are the indirect labor. Okay. Aside from the indirect materials and labor, we also have factory expenses. So they are, an example of this are the rent for our factory space if you are renting, the depreciation of our factory equipment, utilities expense, okay? Factory supplies, and other things or costs that were incurred but are indirectly related to the production of the good or product. So manufacturing costs, they are also known as factory costs or production costs, aside from it being called as factory overhead or manufacturing overhead. So these are the different terms that you can use to relate into this classification. So those are the three types of costs under the manufacturing costs. So the second classification according to the management function of the costs is the non-manufacturing costs. Okay, so what are these non-manufacturing costs? So here, when we say non-manufacturing costs, this refers to those incurred outside the factory or production department. So they are the costs that are not needed to transform these materials into finished product. So non-manufacturing costs, this include our selling expense, general expenses. Okay, so these expenses are not incurred in the transformation of the raw materials into finished products. Okay, so an example is for selling expenses. What we will include here are the advertising costs. Okay, so these are necessary activity to promote the product for it to become saleable and known to the customers or consumers. Okay, however, they do not relate directly to the production, but they are also essential. So aside from it classified under the selling expense, they may be also classified under marketing expenses. Okay. Another is the delivery expense. So this is also important because this is a service, okay, that we or that an entity is doing to deliver their products to the customer's hands. Okay. What else? Salaries and commission of the salesmen. So basically, they relate to the selling activity or the sales. Okay. Although they are also an essential part of the income generation activity of the entity. But again, the main thing here is that you should identify if these costs are incurred within the manufacturing or the production department or outside. Okay, for it for you to be able to classify them under manufacturing or non-manufacturing costs. Okay. So under the non-manufacturing costs, so we have here the different items under these costs. Okay, so we already discussed, okay, the selling expenses. But in this case, in addition, you can also use the selling and distribution expenses, okay, as an account for this item. So again, this will include these costs: advertising, sales and commission of sales personnel, storage costs, shipping and delivery, and our customer service. Okay. What about general expenses? So general expenses, you can also use this general and administrative expense account for this item. What are the examples of the expenses under this? We have the executive salaries, salaries of administrative staff, accounting expenses, legal expense, research and development, and other costs, which relates to the general administration of the organization. So basically, the salary of the accountant belongs to the general expenses. We are part of the non-manufacturing costs. Okay, so those are the two types of costs according to their management function. So we go now to the second classification of costs, which is according to the ease of their traceability. Okay, so first classification is direct costs. Okay, so where do we trace it, or how do we trace it? Okay, so basically in this classification, we have direct and indirect. So meaning it's like still manufacturing and non-manufacturing costs. Okay, so again, direct costs, these are costs that are easily traced to or associated directly with a specific cost object. So they are those that can be traced directly to a particular object of costing, such as the particular product, department, or branch. So here, examples include materials and direct labor, as discussed in the previous classification. Some operating expenses can also be classified as direct cost, such as advertising, okay, cost for a particular product. So actually, you can also add the advertising cost to the cost of your product. Okay, so that makes it a direct cost. Although indirect, in the sense that they are outside, or cost incurred outside of the production department, but still they direct to the, or they are, they are directly, or we can associate, this cost, advertising cost, to the product, because the main purpose of advertisement is to promote the product. That's why we can classify or trace this advertising cost into the cost of the product. Okay, but under the classification of their management function, advertising cost is classified under the non-manufacturing costs. Okay, so another is a cost object is something for which cost is measured, such as a specific product, department, or a branch. So to understand further what direct costs is, so we have here an example. ABC company, they produce plastic food containers. So the cost of plastic that is used in the production, so we can easily trace this to the food containers. That's why it's classified under the direct cost. However, the cost spent for the electricity is not directly traceable to the food container, since such cost was not used solely for the production of the product. So in this case, probably the use of the electricity is being shared throughout the office or the building in which production also is part. Okay, but they use 1 meter only, okay, for their electricity usage. But in certain cases, if you really want to measure the amount of electricity that you use directly in production, they can have a sub-meter, okay, for it. Okay. Another example of direct costs include direct materials, direct labor, and other costs incurred for a particular product, such as advertising and promotion costs. Okay. Another, if the cost object is a department or a branch, so all costs that can be associated directly to that department or branch, they are classified under direct cost. Meaning, whatever cost that department or branch incurred, those are their direct cost. Because in an organization with different department or branches, we have what we call cost that is being shared between the different departments or allocated. Basically, these are the general expenses. Okay, in some cases, general expenses are allocated to the different divisions or department depending on what basis they use. They can use the uh, amount of revenue that they generate or the cost that they incur, okay, depending on how the management allocates such general expenses to the different departments. So again, for this specific department or branch, whatever cost that they incur related to their operations, those are their direct costs. So we have here an example, salaries of sales personnel, okay, are which are directly traceable to the selling department of the organization are their direct costs. Another is the salaries of the sales personnel and branch A that can be directly traced to their branch. So those are the direct costs. Okay, so the second classification under the ease of traceability of cost is the indirect cost. So here, normally indirect costs, they are considered to be difficult to trace directly to a specific cost object. So these are commonly shared. So this is what I mentioned earlier related to the general cost or expense. Okay, so basically, these are commonly shared by the multiple products or different departments or branches. Such costs cannot practically be traced to a cost object. Okay, so that's why it's called general and they can be allocated or shared. Okay, so they are those that cannot be traced to a particular object cost of costing. They are also called, in other words, aside from the general cost, they are also known as the common costs or joint costs. So indirect costs include factory overhead, which operate, and operating costs that benefit more than one product, department, or branch. So examples of this are indirect costs, basically factory overhead costs, okay, or organization-wide advertising, meaning this is not only for the purpose of advertising a certain product. This is the advertisement for the whole uh, organization. Taxes and other common or joint costs. So again, general expenses or cost is the is also an example of the indirect costs. Okay, so in this video lecture, we will only be discussing until this classification. So other classifications will be continued in our next video lectures.